Welcome to Read Between the Lines on News Derby. I'm Sameer Kaushal, and we're going to start with our top story. A major labor standoff is threatening to cripple air travel across the country as Air Canada prepares for a massive strike that could ground its fleet this weekend. The airline has already begun taking the extraordinary steps to cancelling flights ahead of time, affecting thousands of passengers as it prepares for a full shutdown. More than 10,000 flight attendants represented by Canadian Union of Public Employees or QP are now in a legal position to walk off the job as early as this Saturday morning at 12:58 a.m. Eastern Time. The union gave the airline a 72-hour strike notice overnight after contract negotiations officially reached an impasse. In a retaliatory move, Air Canada has issued its own notice of lockout set to begin just 32 minutes later on Saturday at 1:30 a.m. This standoff has immediate consequences for travelers. Air Canada says it will gradually suspend all flights with cancellation starting as early as today, that is Thursday. The airline expects a full cessation of flights by Air Canada and Air Canada Rogue by the weekend, which could disrupt the travel plans of up to 130,000 passengers a day during the busy summer season. So, what is the core of this dispute? Let's understand. The two sides have been at the bargaining table since March, but major disagreements remain on the two key issues. One is wages, and the other one is pay for ground work. QP says the wage increases offered by the airline do not keep pace with inflation. On the other side, Air Canada's Vice President of Corporate Communication, however, says the company has offered a compensation package with an increase of more than 38%, a figure the union has rejected as not being enough. The second major point of contention centers on work done before and after a flight, ground tasks like safety checks and assisting passengers. The union is pushing for flight attendants to be paid for 100% of this time, though Air Canada, which doesn't currently compensate for this work. So now the question is, what does this mean for you if you have booked a ticket? First, Air Canada Express flights operated by carriers like Jazz and PAL Airlines are expected to continue operating as normal. It is main Air Canada and Air Canada Rogue routes that are affected. For those impacted by cancellations, Air Canada has specific obligations under the Air Passenger Protection Regulations. Experts say the airline must rebook you on the first available flight, even with the competitor airline, within 48 hours. If they can't, or if the rebooked flight doesn't work for you, you are entitled to a full refund. Because these cancellations are within the airline's control, they will also have to cover related expenses such as hotels and meals while you wait for a new flight. You will need to present your receipt to the airline to claim those costs. The federal government is watching this situation very closely. Federal Jobs Minister Patty Hajdu has confirmed that mediators remain available to help the two sides finding a solution. However, with the strike and lockout notices now in effect, the clock is ticking and a resolution remains uncertain. The countdown is on, with a potential flight standstill just over 48 hours away. We will continue to follow this story and bring you any new development. Now let's move on to our second big story of the day. Is there a double standards in Canadian justice? The official opposition says yes, and they are calling it a two-tier justice system that they believe unfairly favors non-citizens over Canadians.
When it comes to sentencing non-citizens, Canada has essentially adopted a form of two-tier justice where judges can and have given lighter sentences to individuals who are non-citizens by virtue of this ruling. This offends all principles of fairness that should be foundational to our justice system.
This latest accusation is igniting a new firestorm of debate, tapping into a broader national conversation about crime, accountability, and the rights of those who call Canada home. The Conservative Party is now wanting to table legislation this fall that would fundamentally change how judges sentence offenders. The target of their new bill is a specific judicial practice, the ability of a judge to consider a person's immigration status when determining a criminal sentence. This is not a subtle move, it is a direct and forceful challenge to a legal principle that has been in place for more than a decade and is a cornerstone of the conservatives' push for what they call a common sense approach to criminal justice. According to Conservative MP Michelle Rampel Garner, this practice is complete offense to all the principle of fairness that should be foundational of our justice system. The party's statement goes on to say that the bill will expressly outline that any potential impact of a sentence on the immigration status of a convicted non citizen offender or that of their family members should not be taken into consideration. This is the key detail. It's not just about the offender, but also about the potential disruption to a family unit, a fact that conservatives believe should be irrelevant in the face of a criminal conviction. Rampal Garner put it bluntly, stating that becoming a Canadian is a privilege, not a right, and that removing non citizens convicted of serious crimes is a no brainer. The party's position is clear-cut call for a system of equal consequences for equal crimes, regardless of the offender's personal circumstances or status in the country. But as with any major political proposal, there is a starkly different side of the story. Experts in law and immigration are pushing back hard, calling the conservatives' characterization of the system completely false. They argue that this isn't about giving a break to non citizens, it's about ensuring a sentence is proportional to the crime and its overall consequences. Let's break down the central issue. The debate stems from a landmark 2013 Supreme Court of Canada ruling in the cases of R versus Fam. That decision clarified that a judge can and often should take an offender's immigration status into account as one of several factors during sentencing. The reason is tied directly to Canada's Immigration and Refugees Protection Act, which automatically strips a non citizen of their right to appeal their deportation if they fall into one of these specific categories. They are convicted of a crime in Canada and given a sentence of 6 months or more. They are convicted of a crime outside Canada, punishable in Canada by a sentence of 10 years or more. They were involved in organized crime. They have violated human or international rights law. University of Toronto law professor Audrey McLean explains that this is not a specific carve-out for non-citizens, but rather standard judicial practice, which has a cornerstone of Canadian law for decades. Judges are required to consider a wide range of unique factors for every individual case. These factors could include things like a person's substance abuse issues, whether they are a single parent, or what will happen to their Canadian born child, or their prospects for rehabilitation. Immigration status, she says, is simply one more piece of that complex puzzle. To argue that this is a two-tier system is, in her view, a misrepresentation of the entire sentencing process, which by its very nature is designed to be individualized, not identical. The crux of the matter, according to the immigration lawyers like Fantia Jafari, is the severe, often disproportionate consequences of a sentence of a non-citizen. To illustrate this, let's consider a hypothetical scenario. A young person, a permanent resident named Alex, commits a minor offense, perhaps a first-time theft, that a judge believes warrants a short jail sentence, say 6 months. For a Canadian citizen, that's the end of the story, with a punishment of 6 months in jail. But for Alex, that same sentence carries the secondary, life-altering penalty, automatic deportation without an appeal, potentially separating them from their Canadian-born children, spouse, and family forever. Jeffrey says 2013 ruling simply gives the judge the authority to be aware of the added and arguably disproportionate consequence. It allows them to adjust the sentence perhaps to 6 months less one day to ensure the total punishment is comparable for both a citizen and a non-citizen. This is not about letting them off easy, it's about ensuring the punishment fits the crime, not just the status of the offender. Jaffrey said that to have the provision scrapped is really problematic and something that I would vigorously defend against. Because a judge can't be blind to the fact that this person is not a naturalized Canadian, is still an immigrant, and therefore will have additional consequences as a result of the sentence. So the stage is now set. The Conservatives promise to introduce their private members' bill when Parliament returns in September. This is a highly strategic political move. By introducing a private members' bill, they are forcing a public debate on a difficult topic and putting other parties on the spot. The governing Liberals and the NDP will now be faced with a challenging choice: oppose the bill and risk being painted as soft on crime, or support it and go against established legal principles and the concern of human rights advocates. This specific bill could easily become a key wedge issue in the next election cycle. A clear line in the sand between the two very different visions for the country. This fight isn't just about a legal technicality, it's a fundamental debate over fairness, proportionality, and what it truly means to be a Canadian citizen in the eyes of the law. The outcome of this debate could shape the very foundation of Canada's justice system and its approach to the immigration for years to come. We will follow this story closely as it moves from political rhetoric to the floor of Parliament. Now we turn to our third story of the day. A trade war with China is escalating, and the opposition leader wants a bold billion-dollar response right here at home. In a political move that directly linked two of the country's most pressing issues, our relationship with China and domestic infrastructure spending. Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is urging the federal government to cancel a massive loan and send a clear message to Beijing. This isn't just about the economic policy, it's about the very sovereignty of our supply chains and the future of Canadian jobs.
We've said let's end this loan. It doesn't have any benefit for the Canadian people. And as a result, the Liberals have betrayed what they promised. They said they were going to create jobs here in Canada. Instead, they're favoring more outsourcing to a country that does not have our labor standards, has slave labor that we can't compete with, at a time when we need to build up our industrial base here in Canada.
Mr. Poilievre says the federal government should respond to China's latest move, imposing a crippling 75.8% anti-dumping duty on Canadian canola seed by immediately cancelling $1 billion federal loans to BC Ferries. The loan, provided by the Canada Infrastructure Bank, is intended to fund the purchase of 4 new ships from a Chinese state-owned shipyard. This isn't the first time that this loan has been in the headlines. So many media outlets have been reported it previously. The deal became a political lightning rod weeks ago, after the Globe and Mail first revealed the details of the financing. The Conservative Party has been a very vocal critic ever since, arguing that it makes no sense to send Canadian taxpayer dollars to a Chinese state-backed company. In a powerful statement released today, Mr. Poilievre linked the two issues directly, saying, while the federal government says it will stand up for Canadian farmers and industry, it continues to underwrite a $1 billion loan for BC Ferries to buy ships from a state-backed Chinese shipyards that undercuts Canadian companies on environmental standards, worker safety, and wages. He added a direct appeal to the government. This makes no sense. Canadian workers are capable of building world-class ships with Canadian steel, aluminum, and technology here at home. Calling on Housing and Infrastructure Minister Gregor Robertson to cancel the loan. The controversy itself has deep roots in British Columbia, where the need for new ferries is critical urgent. BC Ferries operate one of the largest ferry systems in the world, a marine highway essential for island communities, tourism, and the movement of goods. Many of its existing vessels are aging, some operating well beyond their expected lifespan, leading to frequent mechanical issues, delays, and capacity shortage that leave thousands of travelers stranded. The company's president and CEO, Nicolas Jimenez, testified before the House of Commons Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities earlier this month, painting a stark picture of a system stretched to its limits. He emphasized that in the fiscal year 2025 alone, BC Ferries carried a record 22.7 million passengers and 9. Jimenez further emphasized that going with another foreign proposal would have added an extra $1.2 billion to the cost, leading to significant and unnecessary increases to passenger fares. He also argued that even if a Canadian bid had emerged, it would have cost more and taken up to a decade longer to build, a delay the ferry dependent communities simply cannot afford. However, this view is not without its own critics within Canada. Representatives of two major Canadian shipyards, Davie in Quebec and Seaspan shipyards in British Columbia, have pushed back vigorously against BC Ferries' narratives. They contend that the procurement process was fundamentally flawed, heavily weighted towards the lowest price, a metric against which Canadian shipyards, with higher labor costs, stricter environmental standards, and better worker safety regulations, simply cannot compete with state subsidized foreign, is the reaction from the BC provincial government. Premier David Eby, while acknowledging the urgent need for the new ferries and BC Ferries' operational independence, stated he was not happy with the contract going to a Chinese state-owned shipyard. Yet he has refrained from intervening, citing the prohibitive costs of cancelling the deals and re-tendering, which he estimated could exceed another $1 billion in an inflationary environment. He has, however, committed to working with the federal government to ensure that future vessels for BC Ferries are built in Canada or at the very least within British Columbia, indicating a desire to rebuild domestic shipbuilding capacity. Meanwhile, the federal government's response has been, to put it mildly, complicated. During the recent House of Commons committee hearing, ministers and officials seemed to engage in a round of political buck-passing. Transport Minister Chrystia Freeland told MPs she was dismayed by this procurement, recognizing the current geopolitical context that includes China's unjustified tariffs on Canada. Yet she repeatedly dodged direct questions on why the loan hadn't been cancelled, instead deferring to her colleague. She did state she had sent 71 letters to Transport Canada agencies, urging them to prioritize Canadian content where feasible and consider countries with reciprocal procurement agreements if domestic options are unavailable. This suggests an acknowledgement of the issue, but a reluctance to directly intervene in this specific high-profile case. Housing and Infrastructure Minister Gregory Robertson, whose portfolio includes the Canada Infrastructure Bank, insisted that the CIB is an arm's-length organization that makes its decision without political interference. He stated that the CIB's mandate is to invest in infrastructure across Canada and benefit Canadians, implying that the origin of the vessels is outside their direct preview once the loan is issued. However, his defense was complicated by his later testimony, where he admitted he tried to see what could be done or undone. After first learning of the deal, only to be told the deal had been executed early in the year and could not be turned around. He since said he's directed the bank to focus on supporting Canadian jobs in the future, a tacit admission that the current system might be flawed in its application. He also put the blame squarely on BC Ferries, saying it's not a decision that the Government of Canada had anything to do with. So the pressure is now immense on both the government to untangle this mess. They are caught between a vocal opposition demanding a strong response to China, a domestic shipyard industry that feels betrayed, and a provincial crown corporation that says it's just trying to serve the public with the best possible deal at the lower cost. This situation raises several critical, thought-provoking questions. Is the federal government's arm's-length defense of the Canada Infrastructure Bank truly tenable when faced with clear national interest concerns like escalating trade wars and domestic job creations? While the CIB is designed to operate independently to avoid political interference in investment decisions, this case highlights the tension when its decision appears to run counter to broader government foreign policy, trade strategy, or industrial goals. The government's statement of dismay, coupled with their inability to undo the deal, suggests a gap between the CIB's operational independence and the government's desired strategic outcomes. Critics argue that in critical infrastructure projects with geopolitical implications, a purely arm's length approach may be insufficient. Now, the second question is, how can Canada balance its immediate need for affordable infrastructure, as argued by BC Ferries, with the long term strategic imperative of supporting domestic industries and reducing reliance on potentially adversarial nations for critical assets? So, this is the core dilemma. BC Ferries argues that the cost and time benefits of the Chinese bid were overwhelming, and that delaying or overpaying would directly impact ferry users through higher fares. However, the shipyards and opposition argue that a national industrial strategy should prioritize domestic capacity and jobs, even if it comes at a higher short term cost. This suggests a need for government procurement policies that factor in not just immediate price, but also strategize value, long term economic benefits, and geopolitical risks, possibly through Canadian content requirement or targeted subsidies for domestic builders. Given the escalating trade tensions with China, does proceedings with a multi-billion-dollar purchase from Chinese state-owned entity undermine Canada's diplomatic leverage and send a mixed signal